Welcome nocturnal minds back to our class. Oh, you are really study hard. Right. Let's dive straight into the deep end with the Sophists. As Plato himself noted way back in the Sophist dialogue, trying to pin down exactly what a sophist is turns out to be quite a challenge. It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall, slippery, elusive, and everyone seems to have their own idea. So, Plato kicked off the philosophical inquiry with, "What is it, the sophist?" in his dialogues, and honestly, we're still grappling with that question today. It's become this persistent knot in the history of philosophy. You look at the big names, Protagoras, Gorgias, Prodicus, Hippias, and Tiphon, there's broad agreement on who these core figures are. They were active in Athens during that late 5th century BCE buzz, making waves. But then you get the more marginal folks thrown into the mix sometimes. Thrasymachus, Critias, the Euthydemus brothers, those anonymous authors of the Disoi Logoi, and even Socrates himself gets dragged into the debate sometimes. Why include them? Because the reasons vary, showing how fuzzy the lines can get. The bottom line is, figuring out who the Sophists were and what they were about is absolutely crucial if we want to understand classical Greek thought, especially how philosophy, as we know it, started to take shape. It's a fundamental puzzle piece. Now, why bother digging into this mess? Well, think of the Sophists as living at a fascinating crossroads, a moment when Greek thought was undergoing massive transformation. They were right there, shaping how philosophy emerged as a distinct discipline, with its own questions and methods. Yet, ever since Plato, they've been consistently sidelined, their contributions downplayed or ignored. This neglect has left huge gaps in our understanding of this critical period. Compared to the Presocratics, they've gotten far less scholarly love. But here's the kicker. If we actually pay attention to them, if we take their intellectual and cultural significance seriously, we start to see a much richer, more nuanced picture of classical Greece. These guys, with all their complexities, are like keys unlocking this whole fascinating era. They weren't just minor players, they were major forces. Okay, so how have people traditionally tried to box these guys in? There are basically two main camps. First, the sociological view. This sees the Sophists primarily as professional teachers, folks selling wisdom, sophia, and training in virtue orte for cash. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of tutors or professors, maybe even hustlers. Plato and Xenophon definitely emphasized this paid teacher aspect, and it's often the go-to definition. It's easy to knock them for being mercenary, contrasting them with the supposedly noble, unpaid pursuit of philosophy. But flip side, they arguably open the doors of learning to people outside the old aristocratic elite. So neutrally, they represent a new kind of intellectual professional class. Their big deal? Bringing specialized knowledge and learning to a wider audience, shaking up the intellectual scene in late 5th and early 4th century Greece. Then there's the philosophical view. This focuses less on what they did for a living and more on what they believed. The idea here is that the Sophists shared certain philosophical tendencies, usually things like relativism, skepticism, doubting whether we can ever know objective truth, especially about ethics or the nature of reality. While Plato and Aristotle give us clues, this view really took off in the modern era, heavily promoted by Hegel, though his specific take as subjectivists is mostly dust now. Still, Hegel was important for recognizing the Sophist philosophical weight. Later scholars often point to their focus on language, or particular views on knowledge, reason, or ethics. If they're not defined by their job, this view sees them as the core of a sophistic movement, united by common philosophical inclinations. Alright, let's poke holes in these definitions. Start with the sociological view, the paid teachers. Sounds neat, right? But does the ancient evidence actually back it up? Not really. Sure, some of the big names, like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Antiphon, are said to have given private lessons. But for others, like Prodicus and Hippias, that's not the main story. And look at the full range of what these guys did. They weren't just sitting in a classroom. They gave dazzling public speeches, wrote books hoping to get published, crafted persuasive speeches for clients, and offered high-level advice, sometimes on geopolitical matters. For many of them, their fame came from these activities, not just tutoring. This makes the boundaries of the sociological category incredibly fuzzy. Think about it. Musicians who took paying students wouldn't suddenly stop being musicians just because they charged tuition. So, defining the Sophists solely by being a paid teacher risks blurring the lines too much. Plus, if you actually look at how the word sophist was used in the 5th and 4th centuries, it wasn't exclusively about teaching. Yes, they were intellectuals making a living somehow, but their real impact seems tied to their public presence, their writing, their debating, not just their private tutoring gigs. That image of them as hunting rich young men captures only a small, perhaps not even the most important part of their lives. What about the philosophical view? This one acknowledges real commonalities between the Sophists. They all seemed interested in human culture, unlike the Presocratics who focused on nature. They paid attention to language, had unconventional ideas about the gods, and grappled with ethics and reasoning. Okay, fair points. But does any single one of these traits define the Sophists uniquely? Nope. None of them works as a solid starting point for a definition that applies only to them. The problem is, the core beliefs often proposed for the Sophists tend to latch onto one or two key figures, like Protagoras and his famous relativism, and then try to project those ideas onto everyone else. It's a bit of a stretch. And guess what? Other thinkers of the time, like Democritus or the Socratics, shared many of these interests too. So, if you try to define the Sophists by shared philosophical views, you end up with a movement that's so broad and diffuse it's almost indistinguishable from the entire intellectual landscape of late 5th century Greece. That doesn't seem right. So, if neither the teacher nor the philosopher label quite fits, what do we do? This volume takes a different tack. We start by acknowledging the traditional list, the 5 core figures plus the usual suspects on the fringes. This grouping has been useful historically. But instead of hunting for some hidden essence within this group, we step back. We see the Sophists as a phenomenon born out of the incredible intellectual energy of their time. They were distinct in some ways from their contemporaries, but also continuous with broader trends. And importantly, the idea of the sophist kept getting revisited and redefined throughout history. Our approach has two main parts. First, we look at where they fit within the intellectual world of 5th century Greece. Second, we trace how the very concept of the sophist evolved from that era right up to today. To make this work, we need flexible boundaries. The category wasn't fixed. It was constantly being negotiated and redefined. So, we embrace the problem. We treat the sophists as a dynamic, evolving category, always in the process of becoming rather than a static definition. Okay, let's get linguistic. How did the word sophistes actually get used in classical Greece? If we want to understand what a sophist was, we need to look at how the term itself was deployed. And here's the twist. The conventional definition we keep talking about, the paid teacher, doesn't seem to have been the dominant meaning in the 5th century. It looks like a later invention, probably shaped by Plato and his followers. There's simply no contemporary evidence for the neat little group of figures we call the sophists. Instead, the term sophistes appears to have been a battleground, a polemical category, much like the term philosophy itself. People used it, sometimes derogatorily, sometimes neutrally, often in ways that don't quite match our modern understanding. So, we need to approach this term with an awareness of its contested history and its potential negative baggage, both ancient and modern. Let's look at the earliest surviving examples, around 478 BCE. Here, the term seems pretty straightforward and positive. Pindar talks about people honored by Zeus for providing a subject, a theme, for the sophistae. This suggests sophistae were professionals, a specialized class, perhaps including poets like Pindar himself dedicated to their craft. The suffix tes implies specialization. Then, Aeschylus mentions a sophistes misplaying a lyre. Even without context, calling someone a sophistes for messing up music points to expertise, linking musical skill directly to Sophia, wisdom, or insight. Maybe it's someone playing moralizing tunes at a symposium. The key takeaway here is that in these early uses, sophistes doesn't just mean poet or musician. It refers to a broader group of people seen as possessing authoritative knowledge and wisdom. Fast forward a bit into the later 5th century, and things get more complicated. The term starts showing up in more negative contexts. We still see rhapsodes, storytellers, being called sophistae, like in Eupolis comedies. But then you get Cratinus talking about a swarm of sophistae, and Iophon and the comic Plato mentioning choruses of them. Now, why would playwrights lump these figures together in a comic way? It hints at a growing skepticism, maybe even mockery, surrounding these intellectual types. Attic comedy, in general, seems to have been a favorite venue for poking fun at the rising tide of intellectuals. Then comes Aristophanes' Clouds, written in 423 BCE. This play is loaded with references to sophistae, and none of them are nice. It paints a picture of Socrates' school as a place where you pay for education in useless pedantry and immorality, fueling the popular image of sophists corrupting the youth. Strepsiades, the main character, wants his son to learn how to talk his way out of debts, regardless of usual piety. He finds a thinkery run by wise spirits who discuss the heavens and promise victory through speech for a price. Interestingly, neither Strepsiades nor his son initially calls these guys Sophisti. But when Strepsiades meets Socrates, Aristophanes uses the term, listing Sophisti alongside Thurian seers, medical experts, and song twisters, suggesting a broad scope of intellectual activity, perhaps all viewed with suspicion. By the end, Pheidippides is expected to return as a handy sophist. So by the time of Clouds, Sophistes clearly names and tends to denigrate those associated with novel, perhaps unsettling, intellectualism, but it doesn't clearly carve out a distinct professional class. Beyond comedy, the term pops up elsewhere in the 5th century. Sometimes it's used for someone whose intellect is formidable but deployed in a sneaky or underhanded way. Think of Prometheus in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, twice called a Sophistes, once when he's reminded he's not as clever as Zeus, once when his fire theft is recalled. It's clearly about his cunning, maybe even his trickster god status. On the flip side, Herodotus uses the term positively, calling the 7 sages, including Solon, Sophisti, and also the innovators Melampus and Pythagoras. This suggests that even as negative uses were developing, an older, more positive sense of the term, someone notable for their intellectual contributions, was still floating around. So, looking across the board in the 5th century, there's no single clear consensus on what Sophistes meant beyond someone who stands out intellectually, whether admired or disparaged. Are there any instances where Sophistes clearly refers to a professional group in the 5th century? Maybe, but not the ones we usually think of. In the Hippocratic text, on ancient medicine, the author contrasts doctors with sophisti who believe medicine requires knowing the origins of man. These sophisti seem to be theorists, developing complex ideas and making public pronouncements, written or spoken, to shape thinking about health. The tone isn't negative like the doctor, and there's no direct mention of teaching, but there's a link to abstract theorizing and writing. Then Thucydides has Cleon berating Athenians for being mesmerized by speeches, acting like spectators of sophisti instead of deliberating citizens. Here sophisti seems to mean those giving flashy public displays. This usage could almost uniquely describe the canonical sophists, but again it doesn't necessarily imply they were teachers. So, while we find hints of professional activity, the target isn't the group we typically label as sophists. So, let's summarize the 5th century picture. When we look at how the term sophistes was actually used during the height of the sophists' activity, what do we find? First, very few times is a canonical sophist explicitly called a sophistes in the surviving texts. Prodicus gets one mention in Aristophanes, but that's it. Second, there's no single defining activity or set of beliefs attached to the term. The activities range wildly from music to running research schools, from giving practical advice to performing public debates. Third, the textbook definition of the sophists as itinerant paid teachers of virtue. That barely registers if it shows up at all. It seems to be a minor, perhaps incidental possibility. The conclusion is stark. The conventional definition we rely on today doesn't really hold water when we look at the historical usage of the term in their own time. It's a later construction. When does the idea of the sophists as paid teachers really take off? Primarily in the 4th century, and especially within the circle of Plato and Xenophon. For them this image becomes central, almost always paired with accusations of greed. The sophists are portrayed as getting obscenely rich, and teaching for pay becomes the basis for their harsh condemnations in works like Plato's Sophist and Xenophon's On Hunting. There's even a hint of collusion in their correspondence, where they both describe sophists as hunters, emphasizing the pursuit of money. This focus on paid instruction was likely a way for them to draw a sharp line between their own philosophical practice and that of the sophists. But was this the dominant view outside their immediate circle? Not really. Look at Lysias. Early in the century, he disdainfully mentions the Socratic Aeschines occupation and calls other sophisti useless because they debate technicalities. Alcidamas distinguishes between different kinds of so-called sophisti. Some write speeches, some help with them, some teach, and even refers to an earlier generation. Isocrates uses the term flexibly too, sometimes praising past figures like writers and speakers, sometimes dismissing contemporary pretenders. Crucially, Isocrates creates a split: the respected sophists of the past, often writers or speakers, versus the current crop, seen as wannabes, ghostwriters, or failed intellectuals. This shows that the familiar image of the sophist as a distinct, marginal group defined by teaching for pay is largely a product of 4th century polemics, particularly within the Socratic tradition. It's not how the term was commonly used, and it's definitely not isomorphic with the historical figures. So, what's the big takeaway from this linguistic detective work? The definition of the sophist as a paid teacher is a retrospective, polemical invention, heavily associated with the Socratics. It wasn't the primary or even common meaning of the term in contemporary usage. Therefore, trying to pin down a single semantic definition is impossible. Instead, the evidence overwhelmingly points to something else. Sophistes was predominantly a polemical category. It was a weapon used to attack certain figures, portraying them as lacking genuine intellect, seriousness, or moral purpose. Their Sophia, their claimed wisdom, was seen as ultimately destructive or unconstructive. This negative polemical strand became increasingly dominant, especially in the 4th century, and it's this strand that Plato and others drew upon to generalize their condemnations, linking the negative sense to a distinct professional class. Historically, then, the term sophist wasn't a stable, natural category. It was a label constantly being contested, defined, and redefined, often through opposition to other groups or ideals. Any attempt to understand the sophists must grapple with this dynamic history of definition. Now, let's briefly touch on the famous contrast between sophistes and philosophos. These terms popped up around the same time. Maybe they were both coined to describe a new breed of wisdom professionals, different from the old guard. But crucially, there's no evidence they were created as direct opposites. In fact, their meanings overlapped significantly. During the classical period, it was perfectly normal to say that sophisti were practicing philosophy philosophian. No irony intended. The sharp distinction we associate with Plato, particularly in his late dialogue The Sophist, came much later, over a century after these terms likely emerged. By then, both terms had undergone significant development and disciplinary shaping. So for understanding the Sophists in their own time, it's vital to push back against this later, Platonic separation, and see Sophistes and Philosophos as inhabiting the same intellectual and professional space. Okay, so we've established that the neat definition of the sophist as a paid teacher is mostly a later invention, driven by polemics, especially from the Socratics. Contemporary usage was messy and contested. Does that mean we can't say anything about who the sophists were? Not at all. Let's shift gears from what is a sophist to who are the sophists. Looking at the individuals, Protagoras, Gorgias, and so on, and considering the collective group, we need to accept that the boundaries of this category were likely quite open. Who exactly counted as a sophist might have varied depending on context and perspective. A useful strategy is to look at other contemporary intellectuals, figures who might plausibly have been considered sophists in their time, and compare them. By examining similarities and differences, we can gain a better handle on the activities and thought of our core group. Our sources for the sophists are a real mixed bag, probably more diverse than for any other group of early Greek thinkers. First, the direct tradition, the stuff we have in manuscripts or papyri. This is small but incredibly valuable, giving us some of the earliest surviving Greek prose. We have substantial works from Gorgias, Antiphon, and those two anonymous texts, the Dissoi Logoi and anonymous Iamblichi. Even Antisthenes, usually lumped with the Socratics, has surviving speeches that feel much closer to sophistic style. This level of direct transmission is unique compared to the pre-Socratics, where we mostly rely on fragments. Of course, there's a bias. We tend to have preserved the rhetorical texts, likely as teaching models. But it still gives us vital glimpses into sophistic writing and the culture of the late 5th century. Then there's the indirect tradition, quotes and references in other authors. This gives us a lot more material, especially for Protagoras, Prodicus, and Hippias. We get verbatim passages, paraphrases, short quotes, titles, biographical snippets. However, the later doxographical tradition, which aimed to summarize philosophical views, often found less systematic doctrine here than in others, leading to frustratingly scant and hard to evaluate fragments. Reconstructing their actual views often involves a lot of educated guesswork. Finally, we have the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon. These have arguably shaped our modern view the most. They focus less on doctrines and more on personalities and activities, creating vivid, if perhaps biased, portraits. Evaluating them is tricky, requiring careful comparison with other evidence and awareness of the author's agendas. The same Socrates problem applies here. Putting all these sources together, even though the volume of surviving writings pales compared to dramatists or historians, gives us a much richer, if perhaps more complex, picture of the Sophists than we have for many other figures. We can say a lot about their lives, their professional practices, how they wrote and spoke, and by inference how they thought. And crucially, we can place this understanding within a much wider context than is possible for earlier philosophers. This brings us to a fourth type of evidence, contemporary texts from other authors. These often show surprising affinities with sophistic thought. Traditionally, this was seen as proof of sophistic influence. But there's enough material outside the core five that it raises questions about the boundaries of the category itself. Cases like these motivated earlier scholars like Kerferd to see the Sophists as a movement rather than a discrete group, which was a step in the right direction, but still somewhat limited. What follows explores how this broader contemporary evidence can expand our view of the Sophists beyond just philosophy, showing them as intellectuals with a wide range of activities and interests. Who looms largest in the intellectual landscape of late 5th century Athens? Undoubtedly Socrates. Now conventionally he's been set up as the antithesis of the Sophists, especially in Plato's dialogues. But has he ever been considered a sophist himself? Absolutely. The latest major collection of early Greek philosophy fragments, edited by Lax and Most, includes Socrates right alongside the Sophists in their volumes dedicated to the Sophists. Their reasoning? Despite differences like travel, charging fees, or political involvement, Socrates shared key interests with this loose group, exploring moral and political excellence, and using language and argument to persuade or convince listeners. These similarities highlight important continuities. The differences that later became so decisive for historiography seem to have been less apparent to many contemporaries. In fact, the very effort of the first generation of Socratics to sharply distinguish themselves from the Sophists might be the strongest evidence that the distinction wasn't universally drawn in the first place. This volume doesn't take a firm stance on Socrates' status. Some contributors will engage with his relevance, others will set him aside. Whether or not you count Socrates as a sophist, looking at him within the broader sophistic culture is illuminating. While he seems distinct professionally, he didn't seem to make a living from teaching or performing, so he didn't need to travel constantly, and he didn't write extensively. Many of his core concerns resonate strongly with the Sophists. Most notably, both gave sustained attention to the investigation of virtue, arete. Both could be seen as contributing to the pursuit of virtue, though perhaps through different methods. Direct instruction for the Sophists, shared inquiry for Socrates, though maybe both used a mix. Related to this is an ethical stance that looks critically at common notions of morality and goodness, arguing they're insufficient for living well, and seeking rational principles to guide difficult practical decisions. In both respects, Socrates' methods might have been more rigorous, his conclusions less conventional, but the fundamental differences in professional activity and approach are debatable. Beyond Socrates, there are other figures who blur the lines or provide important context. Thrasymachus, famously encountered by Socrates, isn't historically labeled a sophist, but his ideas and activities clearly echo theirs. Then there's Critias, Plato's mother's cousin. He wasn't a professional teacher like the Sophists, aristocrat, involved in politics, but his surviving writings on constitutions, psychology, and even an atheistic text place him intellectually very close to figures like Protagoras and Prodicus. Comparing him to Ion of Chios is useful. Ion was primarily a tragedian, but also wrote poetry, chronicled society, and possibly experimented with philosophical prose. Similarly, Stesimbrotus of Thasos, a rhapsode known for Homer, also wrote a work discussing contemporary politics. Damon of Oa, an earlier figure linked to Prodicus, combined musical and philosophical interests, wrote on cultural matters, and was closely associated with Pericles. And Anaxagoras, also in the Periclean circle, contributed to philosophy, apparently taught rhetoric, interpreted Homer, had a public persona, published works, and was notorious for his radical views, enough so that Plato and Xenophon felt the need to distance Socrates from him. These figures show the porous boundaries and the wide range of intellectual activity happening concurrently. Looking beyond individual figures, other genres of writing offer parallels. Early medicine, particularly the Hippocratic corpus, is a fascinating comparison. The doctors engaged with contemporary philosophical trends, discussed topics like human development or the causes of disease, and wrote in prose treatises on specific subjects, a form remarkably similar to sophistic writings. Were their professional lives cosmopolitan, mixing theory and practice, offering instruction, also similar to the Sophists? It's plausible. Classical historiography also connects. Some Sophists, like Hippias, were historians themselves, compiling lists of peoples or Olympic victors. Thinkers like Hellanicus and Damastes were important precedents. Thematically, historians and Sophists often explored human customs and practices, leading to generalizations about human culture, much like we find in sophistic texts on constitutions politae. Both groups were wide-ranging inquirers into the diversity of human experience. Perhaps the single best source for understanding the intellectual ferment of late 5th century Athens is Attic drama. Though much is lost, the surviving plays of Euripides and Aristophanes show drama was deeply engaged with philosophical figures and questions. Euripides, often linked with Socrates even by Aristophanes, was seen in antiquity as tackling cutting-edge intellectual issues. Aristophanes, especially in Clouds but throughout his work, offers invaluable insights into the hot topics of the day, and crucially, presents a strong viewpoint on the social role of philosophy and philosophers in Athenian society. Drama wasn't just reflecting, it was participating in and commenting on the philosophical debates of the time. So putting all this together, the direct texts, the quotations, the dialogues, the contemporary parallels, the drama, requires a synthesis that goes beyond standard methods of studying ancient philosophy. Why? Because sophistic practice was incredibly heterogeneous. Much of it doesn't fit neatly into the traditional molds of philosophical discourse or writing. Were they philosophers in the Aristotelian sense, building systematic, consistent worldviews? Probably not primarily. Their characteristic mode seems to have been investigating multiple viewpoints, often contradictory ones, and refuting accepted ideas, without necessarily offering a single alternative. We see this in the attested anthological text The Fame of Gorgias and Thrasymachus for rhetorical displays, Prodicus's focus on verbal distinctions, and Hippias's Synagoge, likely a collection of opinions. Add to that texts written in the voice of mythological figures, works on literary criticism, anthropology, grammar. The range is vast. Understanding this demands seeing the Sophists as distinctive intellectual professionals, deeply embedded in and reacting to their culture, which itself becomes a primary object of their inquiry, while remaining original in their own right. This companion aims to offer a fresh synthetic perspective on the Sophists as a phenomenon within late 5th century intellectual culture. Two key aspects define this approach. First, we emphasize their embedding within a wider intellectual world, both looking at their contemporaries and their place in the longer arc of history. This contrasts with earlier studies that often isolated them. Second, we focus on themes and methods rather than trying to reconstruct individual doctrines. This differs from the tendency in some recent scholarship to engage in detailed doxography. The structure of the volume reflects this. Part 1 deals with contexts, setting the stage. Part 2 explores thought, organized thematically rather than by individual thinker, with an appendix for the latter. Part 3 examines receptions, looking at their impact on later thinkers. This three-part structure aims to cover the conditions that allowed them to emerge, the substance of their inquiries, and their contested legacy. Part 1 Context lays the groundwork. Chapter 1 looks back at Sophia before the Sophists, exploring the various forms of wisdom practices in earlier periods, and how ideas of wisdom, competition, and patronage were intertwined. Sophia was a form of intellectual branding. Chapter 2 zooms in on Athens, arguing that the Sophists emerged there to meet the needs of the traditional elite operating within a developing democratic system. What made them distinct wasn't just claiming wisdom, but claiming the ability to make others wise, particularly in navigating politics and public speech, skills highly valued in democratic Athens. Chapter 3 gets into the nitty-gritty of the professional lives of the Sophists, describing their actual activities and why they gained reputations, both good and bad. It critically examines the Platonic portrayal, showing continuities with earlier and contemporary figures, and hints at why they faced criticism. Finally, Chapter 4 uses Aristophanes' Clouds to explore the wider impact of sophistic ideas, and argues for the usefulness of the term enlightenment to capture the self-consciousness and interconnectedness of late 5th century culture. Moving to Part 2 Thought, we delve into the characteristic topics they tackled. Given the scarcity of direct evidence, we resist the temptation to reconstruct detailed doctrines for individuals, as that would be speculative or impoverished. Instead, we focus on areas that seem to have engaged multiple Sophists and their contemporaries. By looking at these themes together, we get a richer picture of sophistic thought and its connections. Chapter 5 tackles nature and norms, exploring the crucial distinction between nomos custom, law, and physis nature, tracing how sophists reshaped ethical thinking by focusing on this interplay. Chapter 6 is about the turn to language, discussing how rhetoric fueled their rise and how their focus on language itself led to controversial views about reality, seeing language not just as a tool but as creative of meaning. Chapter 7 returns to foundational questions with problems of being, looking at their contributions to ontology, particularly through Gorgia's famous On Not Being, arguing for their originality, despite often being overlooked in this area. The latter half of Part 2 shifts towards more practical concerns. Chapter 8, Politics in Theory and Practice, examines their contributions to thinking about constitutions and laws, placing this within broader discussions of history and politics. They sought principles by studying existing political systems, creating some of our earliest political theory documents. Chapter 9, Interrogating the Gods, surveys the radical theological ideas of the late 5th century, positioning the Sophists at the forefront, asking provocative questions and offering controversial answers about the gods' role. Chapter 10, Skills of Argument, focuses on rhetoric, particularly the widespread practice of ontology, arguing both sides of an issue, and the unease it generated about the power of rhetoric to make bad arguments seem good. Finally, Chapter 11, Civic and Anti-Civic Ethics, considers the claim to teach civic success, arete, arguing this civic ethics was pro-social, and challenging the notion that sophistic ethics were inherently anti-civic, suggesting such challenges were less common than often portrayed. Many chapters in Part 2 highlight a gap between our reconstructions of sophistic thought and how they were received by contemporaries and later generations. These receptions were incredibly formative, perhaps even creating the sophist category we know today. That's the core of Part 3, Receptions. Chapter 12 traces the 4th century creative reception, showing how the idea of the sophist was debated in the immediate aftermath, ultimately being shaped by Plato and Aristotle. It notes the difference between portrayals of individuals versus the generalization about the sophists or sophistry, arguing the negative legacy reflects ongoing debates about the proper goals of intellectual work. Chapter 13 looks at writing the first sophistic in the 3rd century CE, focusing on Philostratus, who helped define the first sophistic as an age and a broad movement, with echoes in his own time. Chapter 14 covers the sophists in the history of philosophy, tracing modern rediscoveries from the 18th century onwards. It shows how difficult they've been to fit into standard philosophical narratives, leading to their segregation in foundational editions like Diels and Kranz's Fragmente der Vorsokratiker. Balancing their distinctiveness with their contributions remains a key challenge. So, where does this leave us? This companion doesn't pretend to solve the problem of the sophists. Instead, it hopes to reframe it in a more productive way. It moves beyond endless debates about definitions and categorical boundaries. It presents the sophistic era not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a uniquely impactful moment in the history of philosophy, one that has been continually reframed and redefined by subsequent generations. The individual chapters are meant to open up new avenues for research, discussion, and debate. There's already a growing body of work reevaluating this period, and this volume joins that effort, offering a new foundation for understanding late 5th century thought. Ultimately, it poses the problem of the sophists and their era anew, inviting us to continue the exploration.